Welcome back, teachers. In this third episode, I'm going to talk about one of the most truly global themes encountered throughout the diverse civilizations and cultures we studied throughout the AP Art History curriculum, and that is nature. Throughout art history, artists have used nature as a vehicle to communicate deeper, more meaningful stories or lessons to their viewers. An image of nature typically aims to convey a message about something important and relevant to the world the artist was living in. Therefore, most depictions of the natural world can be considered allegories, which is another very common theme found throughout global art history. This episode compares two great works of art, J.M.W. Turner's Slave Ship and Hokusai's Great Wave. I suggest introducing Hokusai's famous Great Wave print after you have studied Turner's romantic powerhouse painting, The Slave Ship, with your class. This is a convenient time to either begin introducing or reintroduce Japanese culture and aesthetics to your class, because the early modern era, which starts around the 1850s, immediately follows Romanticism, and Turner's romantic slave ship was painted in 1840. The reason I say this is because many early modern artists, including many of the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist artists, like Marie Cassatt, James McNeill Whistler, and Toulouse-Lautrec, were greatly inspired by the influx of Japanese artworks freshly flowing into Europe during the later half of the 19th century, especially prints and textiles. So here are a few refreshers about J.M.W. Turner's Great Slave Ship, painted in 1840. First things first, remember that J.M.W. Turner was a British dude, and during this era in British history, there was a huge push to abolish the slave trade throughout the British Empire. The slave trade actually was abolished throughout the British Empire with the Slave Trade Act of 1807, and then slavery altogether was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1833. 7 years before Turner completed his famous painting, with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. While the British Empire had gotten rid of this horrible and inhumane practice, the slave trade and slavery still flourished in the Caribbean and the United States of America. Turner and many of his contemporaries fought to proliferate the abolitionist movement globally, and Turner used the medium he knew best to communicate the horrors of slavery to others. The slave ship, as it is most commonly called, actually has a much more elaborate title: Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. In an effort to stir up the emotions of his viewers, which was usually the goal of most romantic artists, Turner called upon a hideous story from British history that by 1840 was already almost 60 years old. In 1781, a British slave ship named Zong was transporting an unusually large load of captured slaves from Africa to parts of the Caribbean across the Middle Passage. Throughout its journey, more captive slaves were dying than normal aboard the Zong, and the crew made a heinous, financially based decision to throw many of the live humans that were their cargo overboard into the raging Caribbean waters. More than 130 Africans lost their lives after being thrown from the Zong while still alive. What's important for your students to understand here is that the Zong had its cargo insured, as many slave ships did during this era. However, if the cargo, which were the slaves, arrived to their destination deceased, the insurance could not be collected. However, if the slaves were lost at sea, the insurance would cover their losses. Instead of taking the hit and delivering deceased cargo to their final destination, the crew of the Zong decided to throw the sickly slaves overboard. Most, supposedly, were still shackled and very much alive when this happened. A trial followed, and the Zong massacre is certainly one of the major events that set the 19th century British anti-slavery movement into action. Turner uses the power of nature to convey the violence and the ferociousness of these actions. The ship almost disappears as it is sucked into the violent, thrashing seascape, and in the foreground, small little hints of dark arms and legs clad with shackles can be seen fighting for their lives in the turbulent waters. Turner's oil paint is even applied violently, slashed and thrashed onto the canvas, often resulting in large build-up puddles of paint called impasto. Turner's use of an aggressive seascape caused by the violence of a typhoon conveys his feelings about this particular story, but more generally, the actions of humanity against Africans being sold into slavery. Moving on to the Great Wave, Hokusai's famous print is an excellent choice to compare and contrast with the slave ship, because they're both seascapes. And, like I mentioned earlier, the influence of Japanese prints becomes very important for our students to understand in early modern art, which follows Romanticism. Hokusai was an older man when he made this print, which was only one of a series of 36 prints completed by Hokusai dedicated to views of Mount Fuji. Hokusai was from the city of Edo, which we now call Tokyo. Very close to Tokyo is the largest mountain in Japan, Mount Fuji. To the Japanese, Mount Fuji has itself become somewhat of a deity. The Japanese are both fearful of and thankful for Mount Fuji. They fear its potential power because it's a volcano and could erupt at any moment, but they're also thankful for the snow cap at the top, which each spring thaws and provides the city with a water source. First off, an important contrast to make with your students in regards to the two works is their medium. Hokusai's Great Wave and Turner's Slave Ship were created using very different materials. Slave Ship was painted with the super traditional Western medium of oil paint. Since its invention in the mid-1400s, oil paint had developed into one of the most popular painting mediums used by European artists. In stark contrast, Hokusai's Wave is a woodblock print, one of the many printmaking techniques favored by Japanese artists throughout its history. Woodblocks, while labor-intensive, create clean, crisp lines in large, flat areas of solid color. More importantly, the printmaking medium allows for multiple, sometimes even thousands of prints of the same image to be pulled from one plate. So, Japanese prints were kind of viewed as throwaway art. Prints were cheap, and normal people could afford them, and many Japanese people purchased these images by Hokusai that had the sacred Mount Fuji in them. But by far the most important distinction to make between these two works and their mediums is Hokusai's Great Wave prints were plentiful because the medium of printmaking allowed for fast, rapid reproduction. But Turner's Slave Ship is a one-of-a-kind oil painting. Now is a good time to show the two works of art side by side to your students for a cross-cultural comparison. While Hokusai was not focusing on a specific event like Turner was, he still uses the power of the sea to convey a message that was important to him, although Hokusai's intended message wasn't quite as clear as Turner's. In the Great Wave, we see an enormous wave about to overwhelm fishermen in their boats. The men fight hard against the wave, even though the wave is almost surely about to deliver destruction and even possibly death. Many people believe that this fight between the wave and the ordinary, everyday fisherman is conveying the basis of Buddhist beliefs that emphasize going with the flow of life. These men face the waves and the possible danger that they may bring because they know that they have to. It's their job. Depicting ordinary, everyday people doing laborious tasks was something that Hokusai did in his prints, and it set him apart from other contemporary printmakers of this era. While some people view Hokusai's wave as a massive chomping jaw of the sea about to gobble up the helpless fishermen, many who understand the Buddhist beliefs of the Japanese people interpret the great, dominant, and ferocious-looking wave as simply just another mountain of life they must climb and survive throughout their life. Hokusai used his print of the Great Wave and others in the series to capture moments in time, pay tribute to the great Mount Fuji, and perhaps convey a message about dealing with the waves of life. Unlike Turner's Slave Ship, Hokusai's Great Wave does not depict a specific event, nor does it comment on any actions as heinous as the slave trade. But similarly to the Slave Ship, the Great Wave does communicate a much deeper message about life and the way that people in the Japanese culture lived, while also paying homage to a mountain they deemed sacred. Turner communicates through his tumultuously painted seas and swirly, fiery skies his belief that the entire globe should become abolitionist. No human being, he felt, should ever have to suffer again through a fate like those 130-plus souls on the Zong in the late 18th century. Some other famous interpretations of nature that convey deeper messages that I suggest cross-culturally comparing throughout the course of the school year are The Oxbow by Thomas Cole, Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson, and Travelers Among Mountains and Streams by Fan Quan.